the old Magi was talking to the young Magi. And the old Magi said, if you'll remember in our teaching that there are 4 cardinal principles that you must follow that will determine your ability to learn the ways of magic. And as you will remember, it depends on 4 things. It depends on the purity of your intent, the focus of your will, the level of your awareness, and the quality of your character. And the little Magi says, yes, I have reflected on these things. And the old Magi said, and how do you begin to apply them? Because in order to be a magician, in order to learn the ways of magic, you must be a master of 3 things. You must be a master of 3 things. You first must be a master of thinking. You must learn to think clearly and with focus. You must learn, in each of these 3 things you must master, there's something you must control. In learning to control your thinking, you have to control your mind. The second thing you have to be a master of is you have to be a master of doing. To be a master of doing, you have to control your will. The third thing is you have to be a master of feeling, a master of emotions. In order to be a master of emotions, you must learn to control your heart. But before you can control anything, you have to be aware of it. Therefore, the level of your awareness is critical, because the level of your awareness needs to focus in 2 directions. You need to be aware of what is going on at all times in your internal process, in your internal states, and in your external behavior. Only this awareness will allow you to begin to have control. Without awareness, there is no control. Without awareness, you no longer are, you are simply passive to something else. Also, you must intend. Awareness does not happen by accident. It happens by intent. And you must focus your will to make that happen. Also, your awareness must go to those things outside of you. You must be aware of the circumstances that surround you and of the other people that you are in interaction with. Only this awareness will allow you to see what is happening so that you can vary your behavior in order to get what intent you are focusing on. And the little Magi reflected. And as he was reflecting, the old Magi continued. You see, in this world, you can be one of 2 things. One follows the path of magic. The other follows the path that most people follow. The path of magic is the path of being at what we call cause. The path that most people follow is the path of being what is called effect. In this world, you are either at cause or you are at effect. When you are at cause, you are at control and your behavior is self-determined. When you are at effect, you are a victim and you have given up your control to forces outside of you and beyond you. When you are at cause, then when you change, the world changes. When you are at effect, the only way you can change is if the world changes. And you become on an emotional roller coaster as circumstances in the world continually change around you. Look for that which does not change. Look for that which does not change. Look for that for which you have control over. When you discover that with which you have control over, then you can become a master of yourself. And only by being a master of yourself can you be a master of magic. Now go and reflect upon the things that I have told you. And the little magi went away to reflect on the words of the old magi. Okay, today we're going to be dealing with the general area of emotional intelligence. We're going to be focusing later in a specific aspect of emotional intelligence having to do with the tone scale. But first we're going to establish the broader framework of emotional intelligence. Now then, once again, the phrase emotional intelligence has been coined by Daniel Goleman. Daniel Goleman's a rather interesting person. For a number of years, he was the religion editor of the New York Times. And he wrote perhaps one of the best books on meditation that's not been available, I think, for the last 20 years. But in his younger days, this was where his focus was. He also studied at Harvard, a PhD. He studied with David McClellan, the person that created the Power Affiliation Achievement Model, and has had a very interesting background. He's recently written a book in which he's worked with conversations with the Dalai Lama and continuing his work on exploration of emotional intelligence. As with so many things, he's come up with a very good explanation of the what, but as is almost always the case, he lacks the how. So this is where NLP has a tremendous advantage over many areas. We can take almost anything, like Covey's Secrets of Highly Successful People. He tells you what to do, but he doesn't tell you how to go about doing it. We can then also take then what we learned from Goleman, and we can begin to fill in the pieces because we have some technology that allows us to see how we can begin to have control over these things. Now, what Goleman says, he's got two books, Emotional Intelligence and Emotional Intelligence at Work. And in these, basically, he's done exhaustive research, and the conclusions he's come to, that is, in today's world, that the people that succeed are more doing so because of emotional intelligence rather than because of IQ. And he says that at the top in most organizations, people are about equal in IQ. That you're not going to be able to stand out from other people on the basis of IQ. People or everybody's smart at the top. So what is it that makes the difference between those succeed in business, in government, in education, in life? And once again, the evidence is something that people have known pretty much all along. It's just that you hadn't thought of it in this way. People who are successful are people who are popular and who people like. In other words, people who have emotional intelligence. You see, in the world, then, what is it that's going to allow you to succeed? What is it that's going to allow you to succeed? Is it power? Power will allow you to do certain things, but part of power, and the most important aspect of power, once you move beyond gross power, once power enters into the realm of human relationships, it has to do with influence. So what is it that allows you to influence other people? What is it that allows you to be persuasive? What is the key to persuasion? So part of what allows you to influence and allows you to be persuasive is emotional intelligence, and we'll fill in that in a minute. What else is going to allow you to succeed? Accomplishment. So you may be able to go out and do things, but what happens is you reach a point where you can't do any more yourself, and you've got to get other people involved in doing. And so there's a limit to how much you can achieve personally, and there comes a point where in order to achieve more, you have to get and multiply yourself. You have to get other people involved. In order to do that, once again, simply achieving more is not going to do that. You now have to have a whole new skill set, a skill set that's going to focus on getting other people involved and being able to inspire people in order to get people to want to perform at a higher level, to perform more. So that requires another skill set. It requires emotional intelligence. Or simply in order to succeed, another way to succeed, once again, is affiliation skills. Now, obviously, affiliation skills are a heavy component of emotional intelligence, and the ability then to relate to people, to get rapport with people, to get people to like you. And so That's going to be a key part of the formula for success. So once again, we frequently sit around and complain. People that operate out of power and achievement look at the world and complain that it's not fair, because the people that seem to be successful are the people that seem to be liked, and not because they necessarily have any skill. They're not as powerful, they're not as achievement oriented, but still they're succeeding. So what is the key to success? One of the keys to success has always been personality. It's always been personality, and we've known this ever since we were children, and that some people seem to be liked and admired and appreciated, and people wanted to be with them, and other people were too busy doing their thing, too busy chasing after their rainbows, and in general were not focused on other people and pleasing other people and getting along with other people. And so as we begin to observe children at an early age, then these things begin to emerge. So in any case, what we're going to learn today, and we're going to explore this whole area of emotions. So the first thing we need to explore in the area of emotions is we need to start with a simple question. How many of you can control your emotions some of the time? How many of you can control your emotions some of the time? Okay, virtually everybody. How many of you can control your emotions all of the time? Okay, virtually nobody. So that's every time I ask that question in virtually every class, I pretty much get that same response, that people say we can control our emotions some of the time, but we can't control our emotions all of the time. So that's where we have to start. So everything starts with our own relationship to our own emotions. Goldman says that emotional intelligence consists of basically 4 aspects. One is being in touch with your own emotions and calibrating what they are. 2 is being able to control your own emotions. 3 is being able to calibrate other people's emotions. And 4 is to be able to impact and influence other people's emotions. So the first place we have to start is with your own emotions. So the question is, if you're not controlling your emotions, who is? If you're not controlling your emotions, who is? If you're not controlling your emotions, who is? So what is it that controls our emotions? Usually what controls our emotions is circumstances. Circumstances is frequently what controls our emotions. In other words, what is going on in the world around us? What is going on in the world around us? And part of circumstances is other people that we come in contact with. Other people that we come in contact with. Now then, so when we say we can control our emotions some of the time, we can control our emotions usually under that, what is that some of the time? That some of the time is usually when things are going well and we're not under stress, we're not under crisis, we don't have things going on in the environment around us that are causing us to have difficulty in maintaining emotional control. So if we're not in charge of our emotions, if we can't control them all of the time, then what's happening? We're allowing the world then to control our emotions. We're allowing circumstances to control our emotions. We have 2 choices. We're either at cause or we're at effect. We either control our emotions or we allow the world and other people to control our emotions. Those are the 2 options. And the question is, which are we going to do? And it's not only a question of which we're going to do, it's going to require certain training and certain understanding to begin to take on more emotional control. In the next couple days, when we get into spirituality, we're going to find that basically spirituality begins with emotional control. And that unless you can begin to take charge of your emotions, that's going to be the first one of the entry points into beginning to work in any serious way with personal and spiritual development. So, there are some secrets we're going to learn along the way, and we're going to do some activities, and we're going to begin to focus on how we can begin to work with our own emotions, and then we'll begin to start focusing on some of the techniques, including the tone scale, that we can use to begin to be aware of our emotions and be aware of other people's emotions. So once again, an NLP teaches us some things that are very helpful in this area. NLP has some powerful models that can allow us to understand emotions. One of the powerful models is that we learn to calibrate. We learn to calibrate ourselves, and we learn to calibrate other people, so we can see where other people are coming from. So Goldman says you first need to calibrate yourself, you need to calibrate other people. Next thing, you need to be able to control your emotions, and you need to be able to influence other people's emotions. So what is the one, an NLP? NLP is based on several major distinctions or frames that allow a lot of NLP to work. So what is the fundamental frame in NLP that NLP works with that is directly connected to emotions? What have you learned in your practitioner training that was directly connected to emotions? What fundamental NLP distinction did you learn that's going to be critical to understand emotions? Okay, that's one thing. So what set of distinctions did you learn in a practitioner that is directly related to emotions? Okay, all of those things are things we're going to use. That's correct. So all those are correct, and there's something else I'm looking at that's more basic than that. What? Physiology. Okay, physiology is a byproduct, but what is the basic thing that tells whether you're controlled by emotions or not? What is the basic NLP distinction that you have that you're either... What? Okay, but what underlies state? What? Okay, what are two states that you can be in? Okay, no, that's all. Everything you've said is true, but anyway. I mean, this is one of the most basic distinctions in all of NLP. It's one of the reasons that a lot of the NLP patterns work, particularly the long change patterns, change personal history. So what is it that's... Someone just said associated and dissociated. Okay, thank you. So, association and dissociation are two of the most fundamental categories. And what association and dissociation has to do with is basically whether you're in your head or you're in your heart. So when you're associated, you are in touch with your feelings. When you are dissociated, you are out of touch with your feelings. So when you're associated, you're in touch with your feelings. When you're dissociated, you're out of touch with your feelings. Now then, every experience we have has two components to that experience. One is simply what we saw, what we heard. The other component is what we felt. So that when we store any experience, we store the memory of what happened in that experience, and we store our emotional response to that experience. So at any moment of your life, then you are observing, you're participating, you're involved in life, and in your involvement in life, then you have that experience and you have a feeling that was associated with that experience. And you store both of those in your memory. Now then, you don't necessarily have the feeling. You have the feeling if you're associated in that moment. If you're dissociated, there may be no feelings that go along. So there may be no feeling in that memory because there was no feeling to start with. Because you weren't having a feeling, you were dissociated. And meaning dissociated means that you're not having the feeling. Now then, so there's a couple of secrets that we're going to learn right off the bat about emotional intelligence that most people don't understand and that Goldman doesn't talk about. So the first thing we need to understand is this. Emotions are an on-off switch. Emotions are an on-off switch. You're either associated or you're dissociated. You're either associated or you're dissociated. You're either having the emotions or you're not having the emotions. So emotions are something you can turn on, and emotions are something you can turn off. When you turn them off, you become dissociated, out of touch with your emotions, not having feelings, not having a feeling component. When you store that experience, there's no feeling to store there with it because you're not having the feeling. You have dissociated yourself from the feelings. So, the second thing is that emotions generally fall into one of two categories. Emotions generally fall into one of two categories. We have those things we call positive emotions, and we have those things we call negative emotions. We have positive emotions and negative emotions. Now then, positive and negative in this sense is not simply a pejorative term that some emotions we like and some emotions we don't like. Actually, positive emotions charge us and give us energy, and negative emotions drain us and take energy. Positive emotions charge us and give us energy, and negative emotions drain us and take energy. Now then, what everybody would like and what nobody can have is this. So the first thing we have to do is give up the emotional illusion. The emotional illusion is this. The emotional illusion is that instead of one switch, we've got two switches. And the emotional illusion is what we would like to do is turn up the positive switch and turn off the negative switch. Now then, we can't do that. So that's the first thing we have to understand. We can't turn on the positive switch and turn off the negative switch because it's not two switches, it's only one switch. You're either associated or dissociated. You can either have the positive and the negative, or you can have neither. You can either have the positive and the negative, or you can have neither. Now then, what happens is, you see, is certain of these negative emotions may be so painful that in order to cope, we simply turn the off switch on. So we don't want to go through the pain or the suffering of dealing with the negative, and therefore we turn off the switch. And then we may have more pain and more negative, and we turn off the switch, and we keep turning off the switch till we leave it in the off position. And people that have had highly traumatic childhoods frequently have turned off the switch because simply they no longer want to have to deal with that pain. So a lot of NLP, you see, has to do with going back and trying to get the pain disconnected from the experience. A lot of NLP and a lot of NLP therapeutic techniques are all designed to go back to disconnect the pain from the experience so that the past can be a storehouse of knowledge and not a storehouse of pain. Now then, one of the great debates in therapy is the school that says no pain, no gain, which says you got to go back and re-experience the pain, which I consider to be a criminal act. And NLP has techniques that says you don't have to go back and re-experience the pain, but you can go back and disconnect from the pain. So one of the things is a classic example of pain being so great is the phobia. So that people can have a traumatic phobia and that the phobia of the initial pain or the initial negative is so strong that people can't go back and re-experience the experience, and therefore they don't really have any choice because they immediately get the phobic response. And so the question is, what do we need to do? What we need to do is disconnect that feeling from the experience so that therefore they now have the freedom to have the experience without having the phobia or the negative emotions connected with it. So almost all of NLP, particularly whenever we work with the past in NLP, a lot of what we're doing much of the time has to do with dealing with emotions. Where do emotions come from? Emotions are in our past, but being in the past, they still carry forward and affect us in the now. So we can have direct access to the emotions we've got in the present. We can remember our experiences from the past, and we experience and remember the experiences from the past, they may or may not have feelings associated with them. And so if when we were there in the past we were associated, then we're going to have feelings connected with them. If when we were there in the past we were dissociated, then we're not going to have feelings connected with them. So we're going to sort this out a little more as we go on. So far what we've learned is emotions are an on-off switch, and that emotions come with a continuum. Some of them give us energy, some of them take energy, and that the ones that give us energy are positive, the ones that take energy are negative, and that what we need to do then is that we need to be able to leave the switch on. There are certain circumstances in which where the pain may be too great and we may need to turn the switch off temporarily, but in general we don't want to turn the switch off on life, because then we lose out on both the positive and the negative. So the real goal is to be able to accept both the positive and negative and to have control over both. So there's an interesting story. Once again, the choice is we're either going to be at cause or we're going to be at effect. We're only going to be in charge of our emotions, or we're going to let the world determine what our emotions are going to be. Now, part of the problem is that this emotional maturity is something that usually we develop later in life. So by the time we get to that point, usually we've all gone through a series of childhood experiences when we were more emotionally vulnerable. And if those negative experiences are there, we don't have the protective mechanisms we have now, and it becomes more difficult. So this is why childhood can be a nightmare, and it's such a tragically important time. And frequently then that's why it's so critically important to have parents that understand emotional intelligence, and that can work with their kids at an early age to begin to develop it so that they don't get the scars that go with them later into life that then are going to affect them down through time. So we need to work with the emotions then. So the story I was going to tell a little bit is that we assume that we have no control over the emotions. One of the people that I think is has made a great contribution to our understanding of this is a gentleman named Viktor Frankl. And now, Viktor Frankl, how many of you have ever heard of Viktor Frankl? Okay, good, a few of you. Viktor Frankl was a Jewish psychiatrist that lived in World War II, and he was arrested by the Nazis. He was put in a concentration camp. He had written a book. They took away his manuscript. They destroyed it. They shaved his head. They took off everything he had, and they put him in a concentration camp. So he asked himself a simple question. He said, I'm a psychiatrist. If psychiatry has any value whatsoever, then it's going to have a value depending on how I'm going to live in this concentration camp. So everybody else here lacks something that I have the advantage of. I have the advantage that I'm a psychiatrist. I've studied psychiatry. So this is the ultimate test as to whether psychiatry has any value. Am I going to live my life differently than these other people? So he asked himself, what is it I have control over? What is it I have control over? And he said, I don't have control over my body. They can kill me whenever they want. They can torture me in any way. I don't have direct control over that. He said, well, what do I have control over? I don't have control over my fate. They have control over that. So what do I have control over? And he said, well, the only thing I have control over is I have control over my attitude, and I have control over what my response is going to be to circumstances in the world around me. They can't take that away from me. They have taken that away from most of my inmates and most of the people I'm here with. Most of the people here have given up that control. But that's something that they made an decision that they are conscious or unconscious to give up. And as a psychiatrist, I know that that's something I can have control over. so I can determine how I am going to deal with whatever circumstances I have to deal with. And I can determine what my response is going to be. And I have control over that, and I will take control over that. And he was able to survive the concentration camps, and he actually wrote a book when he got out called Logotherapy, another book from death camp to existentialism. And he developed the philosophy that if you've got a why to live, you can live with almost any how. And once you begin to start taking emotional control, then you can determine what your response is going to be to even the most horrible circumstances. But in order to do that, you have to assume emotional control. You have to assume emotional control. Now, all of you have said you could control your emotions some of the time, and all of you have said that you can't control your emotions all of the time. So let's do a little mini exercise here. Get into groups of 5, or 5 or 6 or whatever. Take about 15 minutes, and what I'd like you to do is to focus on a list of those circumstances where you can control your emotions and those circumstances where you can't control your emotions. If you say you can't control your emotions all of the time, then and you can control them some of the time. When is the some of the time you can control them, and when are the times you can't control them? So we need to start now with an understanding at the very beginning of those times which you feel you have control over the process and those times of which you feel you don't have control over the process, because that's what we're going to need to begin to work with. Okay, so straightforward, simple, 15 minutes, get in groups, and start being more specific. Start chunking down. When are those specific circumstances where you can control your emotions, and when are those circumstances in which you can't control your emotions? Finish up, and if you can maybe stay where you are and turn and focus back up here a minute, and okay, so I'd like somebody from each group to report a little on what you came up with as to what was the areas of which you seem to have control over and the areas that you didn't have control over. So I realize this may vary from one individual to another, but what were some of the things that your groups came up with? So why don't we start over here then?
Right. Okay. Control, a resourceful state of confidence, sometimes in work environments, in meetings, possibly in public. Not control.
That's an interesting list. So obviously that we have a normal range that our body operates in. And so you're realizing that under stress, or where we're tired, or where other things happen, then that we may have less ability to maintain control of our state than we do under normal, so-called normal circumstances. So it may be that things having to do with the state of our physiology are going to affect then and then it's interesting that you had grief and ecstasy as things you had no control over.
Some of that has to do with the scale. I mean,
Yes?
on some emotion you could be sort of slightly happy or just hysterically happy, or you could be slightly sad or just overwhelmed
Okay.
with grief. And well, depending on the degree, there's some parts that you might be able to control. And at the extreme degree, when
Okay, so that's a very interesting insight. So somewhere in the middle, we're more likely to have control at the ends of the experience of that emotion at either extreme, then it may be that we're less likely to be able to control it. So the emotion may be like a flywheel. It generates a certain emotion and a certain momentum, And where it gets to that momentum gets great enough, then it begins to have a power of its own. Okay, good. What did the next group come up with? It's on the circumstances in the world. Part of it depends on what kind of state we're in at the time.
Yeah, our own state and our own environment can influence how you interpret something or deal with it.
Okay, good. Okay, next group.
That's exactly what we came up with, because there's that, it depends on your environment.
Okay, so once again, if it depends on your environment, then once again, if your environment determines what your emotions are, then you'll always be a victim of the environment. And if the environment's good, then you're happy. If the environment's bad, then you're sad, and you're continually on an emotional roller coaster ride. If your environment's fairly stable, then it's not a great emotional fluctuation. If your environment is not particularly stable, then there may be great emotional fluctuation. Okay, what did the last group come up with?
I guess that personalness is the thing used to believe. So we didn't have particular examples because we're just saying it's what each of our values are.
Okay, so each of us has values, and she said the more that those values are threatened may mean the more the emotional response. Okay, another area that came up with several things. We're going to continue to work through these processes some in our exploration. So Mark came up with an excellent statement that I'd like to take a few minutes to reflect on, and that to what degree are our emotional responses gender related? So what things are we taught as men and women about emotions and about expressing those emotions? And what impact does that have on our ability to deal with emotions? So what things are men frequently taught about emotions?
Bundle them up.
Bundle them up.
Hey, boys don't cry.
Okay, boys don't cry. Boys bundle them up. In other words, boys are taught to dissociate at an early age. Okay, what else? That's good. So, yeah.
Don't get angry.
Okay. Okay, what are girls taught? Not to display anger and aggression. So you're taught that those are not emotions that are. What else are you taught about emotions in general?
Sugar and spice and all things nice.
Sugar and spice and all things nice. So, but with women, then it's more appropriate to have emotions and to express emotions. And in some of the gender stereotypes, women are frequently viewed on as emotional and men as intellectual. Women are viewed on as associated, men as dissociated. So this is some of the sexual stereotypes. Men, how do you view, if men then you're taught to stuff your emotions, how do you view women then from an emotional point of view? What? Hysterical. So that's one word that sometimes is one of the stereotypes that's applied, so that men presumably are taught to control their emotions, to stuff their emotions, to not be controlled by their emotions, and when they may see somebody that's highly emotional, then they may label that as hysteria.
Cowardly.
What?
Or sometimes
Cowardly.
cowardly. Sometimes.
Okay, so certainly certain emotions that if you show them, then would be viewed as a sign of weakness and as a sign of... So that gets to another issue. If you're operating out of a power orientation, and a power orientation, then certain emotions would be indicated as a sign of weakness, a sign of cowardice. So that's a very good insight. So if men are more, I mean, this simplistic thing, the men are from Mars and the women are from Venus type thing, but if you're the Martian warrior, then you're supposed to be courageous and not show any fear, and there's certain emotions then that you're not supposed to express. Okay.
There are things changing that. I mean, we talked about snags yesterday, sensitive new age guys. It's nice to see a guy try out a movie or something like that. So those values are changing, aren't they?
I think, yes, that those values are are changing and that some of these stereotypes are beginning to break down, and that's an important thing. So it's important to understand that there are certain stereotypes around, gender stereotypes around emotions, and we need to then begin to separate some of this out, because in some ways it's going to be easier for women perhaps to develop emotional intelligence, whereas men are going to have certain constraints put on it as far as how to deal with this. A couple other aspects, and we're going to move forward in our explanation. In the Myers-Briggs model here, that we are taught that there are two ways in order to make evaluations, or what are called judgments. And there's two bases for judgments. One basis for judgment is logic and reasoning, which is a dissociated basis. And the other basis is feeling, which is based on sentiment, based on values, which is a emotional and an associated way then of making judgments. So the two ways of judgment basically come down then to thinking and feeling. Both are acceptable forms of judging, but once again, both are opposites. So once again, part of the stereotype has been that men basically operate more out of the thinking mode and women more out of the feeling mode when it comes to make decisions. And so, and obviously each of these then has a stereotype of the other. So the stereotype of the thinkers that the feelers would have is they're cold, callous, insensitive, uncaring, in other words, dissociated and unemotional. And the stereotype the thinker has of the feeling is they're hysterical, wishy-washy, touchy-feely, i.e. emotional, i.e. associated. So there's some of these things then that are sexual stereotypes that we need to begin to break through. Okay, let me give you another little map here, and then we're going to do another little process around getting in touch with a list of positive and negative emotions for you. So one of the things is understanding a little bit more about where emotions come from. So in your practitioner training, you were exposed to what we sometimes call the Mercedes model, simply because we've got a Mercedes symbol here, but it basically says that if we want to understand human behavior, then human behavior basically breaks down into three components. And this model goes back to the Greeks and probably the Egyptians. So it's basically the oldest and the most common sense model for understanding human behavior. It's the basic psychological model that the world has operated out of successfully for 4 millennium. So basically it says if you want to understand human beings, we've got external behavior, we've got internal state, and we've got internal process. So external behavior is doing and behaving. Internal states are feelings, emotions, and internal process is thinking. Now, each of these has a content to them. So the content of the external behavior is behaviors. And so the content is the behaviors, and behaviors are things that we can see externally. The content of the internal states is feelings and emotions and values. And we'll come back to that in a minute. And the content over here is beliefs. So we've got believing, we've got valuing, and we have got behaving. And in any given situation, obviously, we're engaged in all three of these. So the question becomes, what is the connections and what are the relations between these? So I ask you, can you control your emotions some of the time? Can you control them all of the time? We can also ask, how many of you can control your behaviors some of the time? How many of you can control your behaviors all of the time? So we get the same answer for behaviors that we got for emotions. How many of you can control your thinking some of the time? How many of you can control your thinking all of the time? So it looks like that once again in all three areas here that we have some control over it, and there's times we feel we don't have control over it. So your feelings and emotions are not unique in this respect. So one of the things is we need to be focusing on, and one of the things we're going to need to come back to here is what do we mean by this word control to start with. And that's going to be important. But before we move to that, let's see. We put feelings and emotions over here. And we also put values over here. So that might be some kind of an indicator that feelings and emotions are some way connected to values. And values, once again, have to do with the way that we evaluate, or the way we determine that some things are more desirable than other things. So that's going to be an important thing, because emotions are going to be the thing that separates, and emotions and values are going to be directly interconnected. Because without emotions and values, everything is at the same level. Everything's what's called flatland. So it's like nothing is more important than anything else. Everything is of equal importance. In this world over here, in the world of thinking, then it's like thinking starts with certain statements and then operates on those. But the statements it starts with, it's like everything is of equal importance. Whereas here in the realm of values, everything is not of equal importance. And the fact that some things are more important to us than others is what gives life color, what gives life then, which breaks the monotony of the flatland and gives it the opportunity then for the valleys and the troughs and the peaks. And so therefore we got the possibility that at any experience we can have a variation in the way we respond to that. Now then, another thing that we need to sort out here, and this is one of the things that Goldman actually had some insight into, that he got from McClellan. And so one of the areas that we've talked about is we need to be able to determine what other people's emotions are. And going along with determining what other people's emotions are, we need to determine what their values are, what's important to people. And this area has taken on a particular significance in the business world, having to do with how we hire people. And in hiring people, obviously, particularly in light of what we said the other day about leadership, it becomes critically important that you get the right people on the bus. So how do you know who the right people are, and how do you know who the wrong people are? And so how do we determine what people's values are? How do we determine what their emotional responses are? So one of the standard ways of determining what people's values are, which is contained in that highly dubious book, Timeline Therapy and the Basis of Personality, that says you start off by asking people to list what their 10 top values are, and then you ask them to put those values in order. And so that seems to be a common sense approach to trying to find out what people consider important, what people value. And in the business world, people took that approach, and they asked people what they thought was important, what they valued. People gave them lists, and if those lists matched what the person that was hiring thought they wanted, then they would end up hiring the person. But then what happened is that things went along okay for a while, and then stressful situations began to arise, and people's values suddenly seemed to shift, and they no longer seemed to be operating out of what they claimed was important to them. And so it became clear that that was not a good way, even though it made a lot of sense, it was not a good way to hire people. So at the same time, the question rose, why isn't this working? What's wrong here? I mean, it makes perfect sense, but it's not working, so where's the problem in the logic? Why is it not working? Well, what was happened, and then in the determining what people's values were, the original idea of simply asking them, listing the values, then didn't work, so they had to shift to another way of doing it. So historically what they did is they started experimenting with, well, maybe there's some other ways, there's something we're not doing here, what can we do? And they came up with an interesting approach. They came up with what they call projective testing. And in projective testing, what they would do is they would show people a photograph or a drawing of a group of people in a human interaction situation. So it could be like somebody in a boardroom, a group of people sitting around the table and somebody giving a presentation. or it could be a picture of a bunch of people on a boardwalk at a beach and interacting. And so the instructions you're given is to describe what's going on in the picture. Describe what's going on in the picture. And that you would write a couple of pages describing what was going on in the picture. Who was involved, who were they, what was the situation, what were they doing. Now, what they found is this is what's called projective testing. If you don't have any information about a situation, then when you describe it, what you do is you're describing it in terms of your own model of the world. You're projecting your model of the world on it, and so by projecting your model of the world on it, like if you said, well, the person here seems to be hostile, then there's no evidence that they're hostile. Where is the hostility coming from? The hostility is coming from you, and you're projecting it or seeing it in the other people. So projective testing ended up to be a more effective way of finding out where people were coming from than what people actually said when they listed their values. Now then, in NLP, we can actually go even further and understand where the problem lies. And where the problem lies is, if I ask you to give me your 10 top values, what you actually give me, or what we now have a label for, we call it ideals. So what you're giving me is what you think your 10 top values should be. So what I'm getting is the internal processes, interpretation of what it thinks should be important to you, as opposed to what actually is important to you. Now then, this is the challenge, and has been the universal challenge with dealing with emotions, is that over here in internal process, we have words and we have language. Whereas when we get to internal states, we don't have words. The heart doesn't have words. The head is what have words, and the head will describe what it thinks the heart should feel. But the heart has its own feelings. And so the challenge is, if we want to know what the heart feels, we can't ask the head. The head doesn't know. The head's dissociated. The head doesn't feel. The head may observe, it can use language, but it doesn't know. So we got to have another way to look at the heart to see what the heart experiences. And frequently to see what the heart experiences is, the only other thing we can go on is we can go on the behaviors. And so then the question is, what is presupposed in the behaviors? So frequently to get the emotions, we got to work backwards from the behaviors. To get the emotions, we have to work backward from the behaviors to see what would be presupposed in that. What would be presupposed in that? So, continuing our circling around this process, as we're going to be moving more and more into getting in touch with our own emotions and then working toward this thing we're going to call the tone scale. The next thing is we want to explore a little bit then this connection here between then emotions and values. The connection between emotions and values. That's going to turn out to be an important connection. And in exploring that connection between emotions and values, what I want you to do is once again get into your groups. And I want you to make a list for me of those emotions that are positive and those emotions that are negative. So what are the habitual emotions that you experience that are positive, and what are the habitual emotions you experience that are negative? So you're going to have to come up with a list of emotions, and the emotions, each of you for your own self, needs to see, okay, which are the ones that you experience on a most habitual fashion. Habitual meaning common. There are certain emotions that we experience that are more circumstantial related, and there are other emotions that we seem to experience more on a common basis. So what is your habitual positive emotions, and what are your habitual negative emotions? So I'd like to do two things in this part of the process. First is each of you individually simply take 3 or 4 minutes to write down for yourself a list of what you see as your positive emotions and a list of what you see as your habitual or chronic or negative emotions that are something you'd like to be able to begin to deal with. And then once you've taken 3 or 4 minutes to do that individually, then take about 10 minutes to share that with your group and see how much commonality and how much difference, and come up with a group list of what the positive emotions are that in general you experience and what the negative emotions are that you experience. Also, one other thing. So make the exercise a little more complicated. So I want you all to do that. And then once you've done that, the last thing I want you to look on the list and see, are there some positive emotions that are not on the list that you'd like to have more of? And are there some negative emotions that are not on the list also that if they were, would be even bigger problem for you? So, once again, let me recapitulate 3 parts of the exercise. 1, you're going to take about 4 or 5 minutes, and you're going to write down for yourself the list of the positive emotions and the list of the negative emotions that you experience on a regular basis in your life. Second, you're going to take 10 minutes and share these lists with other people and compile a group list to see what these are. And in the end of that 10 minutes, you're going to take a couple minutes and you're going to ask the question, are there emotions we'd like to have that are positive that we don't see on the list here? In other words, they're ones that we don't in general experience on a regular basis that we'd like to. And maybe also then, are there some negative emotions that we're really happy that we don't have on a list, because they would be ones that we'd really have a hard time dealing with if we were saddled with them. So, okay, let's take 15 minutes for this process, and 4 or 5 minutes by yourself, and then 10 minutes together. Okay, let's start over here with what is it you came up with then in the list of positive emotions and the list of negative emotions. And before you start, maybe let me make one comment. One of the things that many of you immediately begin to run into is that we don't even have common agreement on what emotions are and what they're not. So there's certain things that certain people would say are emotion. How do we distinguish between something that's an emotion, that's simply a character trait, or something that's a value? So, I mean, it's like we can't even get universal agreement what a list of emotions would be. So people are going to fit them into different categories in their mind. We need to understand that when we talk about an emotion, what happens, and this is a general rule that's very important to understand in all of NLP, is that whenever we have a category, then in order to sort things into a category, we need to have a bigger model that allows us in order to distinguish what the characteristics of that category is. So part of the thing when we talk about what are emotions and what are not, the reason we have disagreement is because we've got no universally agreed upon psychology that would give us a set of distinctions in order to sort things into those categories. So we've simply got a general usage of the word emotion in the language that people have different complex equivalences with respect to, and therefore people would put some things as an emotion, and other people would say it's not an emotion. In any case, so what did you come up with was over here as positive emotions and negative emotions?
You came up with happy, being personal and for others, excited, confident.
Okay, wait a second. Let's be a little so everybody can hear. So we've got the first one was happy, excited. Okay. Confident. Love. Okay. Now these are positive emotions. Okay. Giving. Sharing. Now you see, people may say, is giving and sharing an emotion, or is it simply an activity? Is it a behavior that is a result of an emotion, or is it as a emotion in and of itself? And also, as we go through these things, one of the things to be looking for is, I said, one way we can use to distinguish between positive and negative emotions is positive emotions give us energy, negative emotions drain energy. So these things so far, most of them we would say probably give energy, although giving may or may not, depending on what is given and what's involved. So, okay, so other things on the list of positive? Okay, what's your... Okay, wait, why don't we wait and come back to that? So that would be good. Okay, and we'll come to your negative emotions in a minute, but let's go collect all the positive emotions to start with. So what were some of the positive emotions you came up with over here?
Enthusiasm, encouragement,
Okay, wait a second. Enthusiasm, encouragement,
optimism,
optimism,
belief in possibilities,
belief in possibilities,
hope,
hope,
curiosity,
curiosity, courage,
passion,
passion, determined,
resourcefulness,
resourcefulness, gratitude,
flexibility.
flexibility. Now, some of these are obviously emotions. Some of them we might argue are behavioral characteristics, like is flexibility an emotion? And once again, the answer is it depends on how you look at it. It depends on what bigger categories you're using to fit it into. And does flexibility give us energy? It may or it may not, depending on the circumstances. Okay, good. Other items?
Pleasure,
Pleasure,
joy,
joy,
fun,
fun,
and we had energy down.
energy. Okay. So once again, is energy an emotion? And there's obviously, depending on how we look at energy, and when we get into the couple days on spirituality, we're going to go into a typology of energy, and we'll begin to see then about positive and negative energies and how that all works together. Okay, what did you all come up with for positive emotions?
Had optimism,
Optimism, okay.
enthusiasm,
Enthusiasm. So now we've a couple of groups have had those. And actually, remember this enthusiasm, because this afternoon we're going to get to a emotional scale. And we're going to find enthusiasm's one of the things at the top of the list. So it's interesting that in a couple of groups, within one of the first two things you listed was enthusiasm and optimism. Okay, other things.
sense of well-being,
Okay,
courage,
courage.
faith,
Okay, now courage, once again, is does courage charge us or courage drain us? Probably in a situation where courage is required, it would charge us. Okay, faith, love, joy,
self-belief,
self-belief, desire,
we have
sharing,
tenderness,
tenderness, success,
achievement,
achievement,
affection,
affection,
discovery and learning,
discovery and learning,
contentment,
contentment,
calmness,
calmness,
happiness,
happiness, anger. Oh, okay, so obviously some people are going to have that on the other list. So does anger give you energy or does it take energy?
sometimes give you energy because it can move things along.
Okay, it can move things along, and at the same time, are you investing energy in order to do that? So anyway, we'll come back to that. Okay.
Intrigue,
Intrigue, okay. Interest,
freedom, and that incorporates a feeling of space,
okay.
confusion, and determination.
Okay, so confusion and determination obviously are, once again, these things can be positive or negative depending on how you look at it. So, but this is where you put it, and that's what's important at the moment. Okay, the last group, what did you have for emotion? Positive.
Interest,
Okay, wait a second, start slower so everybody gets it again. Laughter, okay. So is laughter an emotion or is laughter, once again, simply a behavior? But once again, it depends on how we look at it. Interest, okay. Excitement. So once again, we find enthusiasm near the top of one of the list, okay. Contentment, another one. This contentment, pay attention to that. We're going to hear that again this afternoon. Joy, happiness, love, compassion, curiosity. Some emotions you see are more intellectual oriented, some are more activity oriented, some are more relationship oriented. Okay, what else? Okay, you borrowed those. Okay, that was the group where you had that. Those were the ones where you had commonality then. And after that, then people had individual ones, but those were the commonality ones. Okay, good. Okay, well, let's look at the list of some of the negative emotions now. Now, negative emotions are things, once again, that drain us, that take energy from us. So what are some of those? We'll start over here and go the other way again.
Anger.
Okay, anger. So the other people you see had anger as interestingly enough, had it as a positive emotion. But for many people, anger is a challenge, okay. Others, disgust, fear, boredom, sadness, sympathy, worry, apathy. Okay, now notice that grief, apathy, worry, these are some emotions that are going to show up this afternoon when we get into the tone scales. So make sure you keep these lists, and we're going to find some interesting things about these lists this afternoon as we get in to move on. Okay, next.
We've got self-pity,
Self-pity.
anger at others, and anger at ourselves.
Okay, we can be angry at other people, we can be angry at ourselves.
I come second or last. Doubt. That was a good one to come before doubt, wasn't it?
Doubt,
Fear,
fear,
resentment,
resentment,
frustration,
frustration,
powerlessness,
sadness,
sadness,
boredom,
anxiety,
grief,
grief,
hopelessness,
confusion,
regret,
loss,
loss,
and exhaustion.
and exhaustion. Okay, so that's once again an interesting list. A couple of the things you had right after each other on that list are interesting. Two of the things you had on there were fear and doubt. Before I came out here, I was having lunch with a colleague of mine that I do work with, and we teach a seminar together, which is called the Rainmaker, which is a advanced sales seminar. And this gentleman is interesting in as much as in his industry that he has worked in his life, he was a printing salesman. And he was a unique individual in as much as that he was the most successful printing salesman in the history of his industry in the world. So he sold, 1 year, his top sales were $165 million worth of printing sales, and nobody's come, the closest anybody's come is like 120 million. So he's proved that he was able to do what he set out to do. So, but in any case, in talking to him, he's a very, needless to say, a very positive individual. And so every time I see him, it's always interesting because it's like he's had something that has touched him that he's been reflecting on. And so right before I came out here, when I was having lunch with him, he said that he had got some quote from a book he'd been reading, and basically it said simply that what would happen if you would simply do two things. The two things is eliminate doubt and fear from your life. And the way it was put is doubt and fear are emotions. So simply choose not to experience doubt and fear in your life. And he'd said that that had inspired him, and he had made a conscious decision that he was going to eliminate all doubt and fear from his life. And in doing that, all sorts of positive things, which he interpreted as positive omens, had happened, and about 5 or 6 things that happened serendipitously in the week, and he viewed those as a direct result of this decision on his part to take control over eliminating these two negative emotions. Okay, what is the next group? What do you have for negative emotions? Frustration, anxiety, fear, anger, discomfort, disappointment, overload, hate, despair, grief, cowardice, apathy, sense of failure, nervousness, loneliness, boredom, stress, and tiredness. Okay. Okay, once again, some of these are behaviors, but once again, it depends on how we look at them. They can have different aspects. Okay, the last group, what are? Sadness, anger, resentment, fear of failure, okay.
And we have grief.
Grief, okay. unsure and indecisive. Now, once again, are those behaviors or are those emotions? Okay. Now, the last question I had is, what are some positive emotions that are not on that list that you would like to have some more of? So why don't we go back over here and start and go over that a second. You never got there, okay. So did you all get there? Not quite. Well, I know you got there, so what? Okay, good. I'll come back to you in a second. So what did you come up with? More determination, more accomplishment, and more contentment. Okay. Okay, and what did you come up with over here then? More passion. More fun. More humor. Now, this is the first time humor, I think, has appeared on any of the lists, so that's interesting. More excitement. Hilarity. So humor and hilarity. And freedom. Okay, once again, is freedom an emotion and behavior or what? Or a combination thereof. Okay, so there's several things I'd like you to be aware of here. And so a few more frames around emotions before we go to lunch here. So you come up with lists of so-called positive and negative emotions. And and emotions, obviously, ultimately what things manifest in is some forms of behavior. And so it may be that we're going to have to deduce what the emotion is from the behavior. Some of these things are things that you think you should want, and some of the things are things that actually are emotions then that you experience. Now then, so let's talk about certain emotions like grief, anger. There's an important thing to understand about emotions. One is that emotions have structure. Emotions have structure. And what do I mean by that? I mean, take grief. So what is the structure of grief? The structure of grief is that you have lost something that was valuable to you. You have lost something that was valuable to you. That's the structure of grief. What is the structure of anger? The structure of anger is a little more complicated, but understanding the structure actually is critically important. So I'll come back to that in a second. So what is the structure of anger? Anger is always associated with expectations. So the structure of anger is that things are not working out the way you expected them to work out. So you're able in your mind to create a better reality, and that reality doesn't actualize itself, and therefore you're angry because it didn't work out. Now, there can be several responses to a situation, so it's interesting that anger and despair are frequently interconnected, and the basic, and a lot of them have to do with perfection. So let's see how some of these emotions can be interconnected. So in our minds, we have the ability to do construct, and we can frequently create in our minds a better world than the world we're actually in. We can create a better world than the world we're actually in. So if we can, in our imagination, come up with a better world, or come up with the way we'd like things to happen and they don't work out that way, then we've got two responses to it. One response is to be angry, and that's the response in which we're going to say, okay, we're angry, and we're angry because the world's not perfect and because our expectations have not been satisfied. That's the more active approach. The passive approach is, well, we're going to get depressed because we can create a better world in our fantasy than we can in reality, and therefore we prefer the fantasy world to the real world. So this is frequently what happens to melancholy poets that go into this state and that end up sad and depressed, and this causes common outgrowth of being creative and being able to figure out in your mind a better world than the one you live in, and then you're depressed because the fantasy world isn't the real world, and the real world's not the fantasy world. So one of the things is when we understand that emotions have structure, One of the places, obviously, in NLP where we deal with emotions is in a therapeutic and in a business context. And so in a therapeutic context, you get people that are stuck in certain emotions, and one of the challenges of beginning to deal with them is to deal with these emotions that are stuck in. And frequently, understanding the structure of those emotions is going to be a way to begin to help people deal with them. In a business world, understanding the structure of emotions frequently is a way then to help people work through problems that may come up in the workplace. So if people are angry, then the reason they're angry is because they had some kind of unrealistic expectation that wasn't met. So instead of dealing with the anger, you see, frequently you can't deal with the emotion directly. Frequently you have to deal then with what is the root cause or what is the process that generates that emotion. When we realize it's an unrealistic expectation, then by getting people to change their expectations, then you can either eliminate anger or you can create anger. So by the expectations that people operate out of. So understanding the structure of the emotions, and each emotion has a different structure, and sometimes it's more evident than others. So one of the things we can do is go in and focus on any given emotion on what the structure is. The next thing we need to understand about emotions is that emotions may or may not be appropriate under certain circumstances. So grief is an emotion that we feel if we have some loved one dies, then it is normal to experience a sense of grief. That's a normal human reaction. Now, the important thing is to understand that that reaction is to go through a grieving process and then complete that process and move on. The problem is when it becomes chronic. So one way we can look at emotions, we're going to make a distinction between what we call, and this is perhaps not the best language, but it was some language that we've been given. It's what we call an acute emotion, which is simply an emotion we're experiencing in the moment, as opposed to a chronic emotion, which is an emotion we experience habitually. So grief is something that it's certainly appropriate to go through a grieving process, and many societies have designed rituals basically to take the grieving process and to reduce it to a certain time frame, and once that time frame is completed, then it's time to move on. Some people are not able to move on when it's time to move on. So one of the things we need to understand is there are certain emotions that do take energy out of us. And the problem is usually not that if we experience that emotion temporarily, the problem is if the emotion becomes chronic or if it extends beyond a certain time frame. So all of us are going to encounter negative emotions at certain times in our life. And the challenge is not simply to not have the emotion, to not grieve, which is usually what has happened, is not an appropriate response. The appropriate response is to go through the process and move on. So one response to grieving frequently is the response of turning off the switch. So frequently people dissociate. So there's a poem that says, after great pain, a formal feeling comes. The nerves sit ceremoniously like tombs. So basically we numb ourselves down, we dissociate, we don't deal with it. And a common pattern with respect to grief is the first reaction frequently is dissociation. And frequently people don't experience the grief to weeks or months after the actual death has occurred. So people don't necessarily experience it immediately. Frequently they simply dissociate, and then a month or two later when they stop dissociating, then they actually experience the grief at that point. So it's delayed, it's not eliminated, it's simply pushed back. Now then, also when we have emotions that become chronic, we call them moods. So a mood is an emotion that simply is there over time, and once again, moods may be positive or negative, but a mood is simply an habitual emotional state that somebody gets locked into. So Korzybski's definition of sanity is your behavior is suited to your environment. One definition of a sanity may be also that your emotions are suited to your environment. And there are several levels then of being able to have what we would call emotional maturity. One level is simply turning the switch on and off, which is a very low level of dealing with it. The second level is a higher level is experiencing the emotions acutely, in other words, in time, but then letting go of them. Emotional immaturity is when they become habitual or become moods, and so it's appropriate to experience positive and negative emotions, but it's appropriate then to not get stuck in them, but to be able to move through them and to realize they have a time and a place. Okay, there are two other things, major points we want to make before we go to lunch that are going to help us this afternoon when we move on further in our exploration. Another thing, one of the things that was real valuable in beginning to deal with emotions is that when we did the original work that led to the book, that highly dubious book, Timeline Therapy and the Basis of Personality, we found that emotions have a temporal component. And actually, Leslie Cameron Bandler, in her book on emotional hostage, one of the parameters she used to focus on emotions is to say that emotions have a temporal component. We had timelines we were working with, so then it was an obvious connection. Well, let's say use the timelines to work with the emotions. So what this means is there's certain emotions that you can only experience in a certain time frame, both positive and negative. So negative emotions associated with the past are things like guilt and grief. You can only feel guilt and grief about something that's already happened. Negative emotions associated with the present are boredom. You had boredom on a lot of your lists. What is boredom? Boredom is lack of stimuli. So, and then there's certain negative emotions associated with the future, such as fear and anxiety. You can only be fear and anxious about things that have not yet happened. There's also going to be positive emotions in these different time frames. So one of the first things is to understand what is the time frame in which the emotion actually can occur. So emotions have a structure. Emotions have time frames in which they exist. Now then, what happens is where emotions frequently become pathological is when they extend beyond the time frame in which you can normally have them. So let me give you an example. People that frequently have, that may come for therapy because they've got emotional problems, may very well be because they've created incredibly complex strategies to be able to experience emotions on a chronic basis in time zones that they would normally not be able to experience them in. So I was teaching a class years ago in Detroit, and I had a lady who was a psychologist in my class, and she was an expert on grief. And unfortunately, she'd had a child that had been killed in an automobile accident, and she had decided she was going to devote her specialization in psychology to grief counseling. So I made the statement, I said, you can't experience grief about something that's not happened. You can only experience grief about something that happened in the past. And she said, no, 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 that's not right. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. I always like to learn things. And I said, well, how do you do that? How do you do that? And she went, oh, this is the way you do it. She said, what you do is this. You go up on your timeline. You go out to the end of your timeline. You turn back at a point in which every significant other in your life is dead. And you experience overwhelming grief. And I went, incredible. I said, what you've just described is the structure of human pathology. There are people that do that. Sane and normal people would never do that. But there are people then that are insane that figure out how to maintain suffering under conditions that you would not normally be able to maintain it under. So it's like one of my experience in studying people is that human beings seem to have two characteristics. One, they seem to keep beating their head against the wall, no matter how many times they've done it. And the second thing is people refuse to give up suffering. When you take away their suffering, they refuse to give it up, and they'll do everything they can to hang on to their suffering and to maintain their suffering. So people will go to incredible lengths in order to be able to maintain their suffering. It becomes part of their identity and part of their justification and rationale for living. So yes, you can do these things, but when you do them, they are pathological. But the important thing is once we understand you can do this, we're working with emotions. We need to understand the structure of emotions so we can work with them ourselves, so we can help other people who are dysfunctional in relations to emotions. And so we basically need to be able to do two things. We need to, for ourselves and for other people, we need to be able to control the negative emotions in our life. We need to experience them when appropriate and let go of them. And we need to be able to generate more positive emotions in our life. The second thing is with other people, we need to be able to help them to let go of the negative emotions that are creating problems for them. And we need to help them to experience more positive emotions in their life. Now, depending on our relationship to other people, if our relationship is a therapist, Mark was discussing a situation with a client this morning that he was working with that's got an habitual pattern and that's locked in, and that the thing about we've got so-called normal, healthy people that don't have problems, but other people may live exactly the same life, same circumstances, but it becomes a problem. So what is it that they're doing then? How do they create the problem? And what is the structure? How are we creating the problem? And how are we sustaining the problem? So as a therapist, those are things we need to figure out. How are they creating the problem? How are they sustaining the problem? If as a business, in a business situation, as a manager, as a leader, people under you, you need to understand their emotions. You need to understand how they generate emotions, and you need to understand how they sustain their emotions. Particularly, how do they sustain negative emotions that they need to let go of? And what they don't seem to be able to do, which is what they need, is to learn how to sustain the positive emotions that they may experience temporarily. Okay, final thing we need to cover before we go to lunch is a little bit on the physiology of emotions and where do emotions come from. Where do emotions come from? Because if we're going to generate emotions and sustain them, we need to understand where they come from. And first, we also need to understand how we experience them. So a standard question I ask people is, what is an emotion? What is an emotion? Try asking people what an emotion is. Most people are, it's a common, ordinary thing that you find in and around the house that you've experienced all your life, but when somebody asks you what the hell is an emotion, hardly anybody can really come up with a good definition of what an emotion is. They'll say it as emotion is a feeling or something, or what's a feeling? It's an emotion. So we get a circular definition that really doesn't do us any good. So seriously, what is an emotion? So in NLP, if we're going to deal with emotions, we've got to have some way of kind of fitting it into our model. So what is an emotion? So first, where do we frequently encounter emotions in NLP? We've got some maps we operate out of in NLP. So what do we usually associate emotions with in NLP? Okay, I'll give you a hint. So in terms of the I model, what do we associate emotions with? In your practitioner training, you learn the I model, where the I's go. So when I'm experiencing, yes, Mike? Okay, kinesthetic downright. So normally we're taught, obviously in NLP, we're taught in Practitioner 101 that emotions have to do with kinesthetics. And that obviously we look down right. If a normally wired right-handed person would look down right when they're experiencing emotions. Now then, this is true as far as it goes, but there's a couple further qualifications we need to start learning at a master practitioner level. So first we need to make a distinction between emotions and sensations. We need to make a distinction between emotions and sensations. So what does kinesthetics have to do with? Kinesthetics really has to do with sensations. So what is a sensation? Sensations then are sensations in our body. There's sensations on the surface of our body, and there's sensations that are mediated by sensors inside our body that are mediated by the nervous system. So we can feel on the surface of our skin, we've got 5 kinds of sensors that can sense moisture, that can sense temperature, that can sense pressure, that can sense texture, and can sense pain. And inside our body, we've got sensors that then can also sense these things, and we can have sensations in different parts of our body. So what we directly experience in terms of kinesthetics is sensations. So what is an emotion then? So an emotion is experienced internally as a matrix of sensations. Since all we've got internally in our body that we can experience are sensations, therefore an emotion's got to be connected in some way, and an emotion is a matrix of sensations. In other words, it's a combination of sensations in various parts of our body, to which we attach a label, so that therefore I can say, are you happy or are you sad? And in order to answer that question, what you do is you go in unconsciously and you introspect the sensations in your body, and you say, I would apply the label happiness to the sensations I'm experiencing at the moment. So if we really wanted to get in touch with our emotional anatomy, what we would do is we would go through every one of these emotions, we would experience it, and then we would see where in our body, what combination of sensations is leading to that emotion that we associate with that emotion. So, emotions are meta. Emotions then are a combination of sensations, and we have labels we use to describe those states. Okay, and then the last thing is, where do emotions come from? So, if we're going to deal with emotions, we need to know where they come from. Emotions don't come out of nowhere. Emotions don't come out of thin air. Emotions basically come out of one of three places. Emotions basically come out of one of three places. Once we know this, then we've got an important understanding as far as how to generate and sustain emotions. The first thing emotions come out of is they come out of pictures. And the pictures are either external or internal. They're either pictures in our head, which may or may not be in our conscious awareness, or they come out of pictures simply looking out externally in the world. So standing and looking at a beautiful sunset, looking at the smile on the face of a baby, those pictures, what we're looking at externally, then go through a synesthesia to generate a emotion in us. So we have a VK synesthesia. So emotions are always going to be the result of a synesthesia, and the first synesthesia is a VK synesthesia. So it's either a picture we're seeing outside, or a picture inside, or a picture outside of our conscious awareness. So one of the standard examples of emotions outside our conscious awareness, pictures generating emotions, is one of the standard ways in which people experience jealousy. So people will come into therapy and they'll say, I just don't understand. I'm just overcome with these feelings of jealousy. I mean, I know that my husband is totally faithful to me, and I don't know what's happening. It's like all of a sudden these feelings come out of nowhere or something, you know. Yeah, they're coming out of nowhere. They're coming out of the pictures the person's making outside of their conscious awareness, creating of their spouse with somebody else, and that's what's generating the feeling. So one of the things is we need to see then if emotions are coming out of pictures, what are the pictures? The second place they come out of is they come out of tonality. So there is ATK synesthesia patterns. So the most common place they come out of is the tonality of our internal dialogue. So one of the things is, one of the problems in NLP is with the basic I models, which is a good start, but like when I teach modeling, which I will be doing in Fiji this summer, or I guess it's in the fall. Summer is a relative thing. I keep thinking I'm in summer and forgetting I'm in winter here. But in any case, the basic then eye pattern model we need to elaborate on and have a much more sophisticated. So frequently we're taught when I'm down here, I'm in so-called auditory digital. Now, auditory digital has two components to it. Digital actually has to do with meaning. Digital actually has to do with meaning and sense. Now then, when I'm talking to myself, if you ask people what AD is, most people say your internal dialogue. Your internal dialogue has two parts to it. One is the sense of what you're saying, and the other is the tonality. Now, it's the tonality of your internal dialogue is one of the primary ways that people generate and sustain emotions. So people start talking to themselves in their head in a certain tonality, and suddenly they start feeling angry. So if you want to be angry, then talk to yourself in an angry tone of voice, and you're going to get angry. And if you continue to talk to yourself in that angry tone of voice, you're going to continue to stay angry. So one of the things is that we need to understand that many of our emotions then are generated and sustained by the tonality of our internal dialogue. Now, emotions also, we may have the KK synesthesia, so certain emotions may lead to other emotions, or certain sensations may lead to a feeling of emotion. And so, therefore, the bottom line, and we'll go to lunch here, is that if we want to control our emotions, once the emotion starts, it's frequently too late. Once the emotion starts, it's too late. So we've got to control the pictures, we've got to control the tonality of the internal dialogue, we've got to control the sensations. If we control those three things, we can indirectly control the emotions. So these are the three things we're going to have to work with. We're going to have to work with the pictures we put in our head, we're going to have to work with the tonality of our internal dialogue, we're going to work with the physiology, the sensations in our body, and we're going to work with time frames. These are things we're going to work with to begin to work with emotions. So this morning we've been in an exploration process. We've found out some things about our emotions. We've found out some things about other people's emotions. We found out things about how we experience emotions. This afternoon where we're going to be going is going in a couple of directions. So one thing we're going to do is we're going to move into an understanding that actually emotions are not random, but that emotions actually exist on a scale, which we're going to call the tone scale, and we're going to learn how to use that in working with our own emotions and working with other people's emotions. And then also this afternoon, we're going to start working on experiencing how we can begin to gain control over association and dissociation, and how we can begin to generate positive emotions, which is what we need more of, and how we can begin to control negative emotions. Does that sound helpful? Is that where we'd like to go? Okay, so everybody up. One hand up. One hand down. All of you have said that you can control your emotions, your behaviors, and your minds some of the time. But what would happen if you could control your emotions, your behaviors, and your mind all of the time? Something to think about over lunch. Whoosh!
And I can't fight this feeling anymore. I've forgotten what I started fighting for.
To mention three things, I don't normally like to do advertisements, but I better say a few things about three possibilities here for you. One is the next couple days we're going to be doing NLP and spirituality. And some of you should probably be here for the next couple days, but for some reason you selected not to be. And I'm also told we got a predominance and preponderance of women, and that you men are particularly apparently prone to overlook a certain aspect of your development that probably you should pay more attention to. So remember when we talked about Maslow's hierarchy, we said that once you get your self-esteem thing taken care of, and the fact that you all are not ready to go up here may mean that you've got some problems you've got to deal with at this level, but I'm assuming at some point you're going to get that handled, and then this is where you're going to need to go. And so it would be helpful to have an idea now about what is some of what's involved in that. Another way to look at it is there's an aspect of psychology that's called transpersonal psychology. Now, what transpersonal psychology says is that we go through a developmental process, and in the developmental process we move from our bodies, and so we start with the physical, and then we develop an emotional center, then we develop an intellectual center, and then we develop a higher emotional and a higher intellectual center, which is called a soul and a spirit. And that if you're going to understand your own development, you can only understand your development once you take the whole map into account. A lot of people in the diseducational system were taught to pay lip service to our body and physical education. The great tragedy is there's no school anywhere in the world that we're taught to deal with our emotions, and the diseducational system pays a lot of attention to presumably developing our intellects, but doing it in a very mechanical way that frequently causes more harm than good, and it obviously ignores anything above that. So there is a path of development, and there is, at the top of the path of development, we move then into things beyond ourself. We move into self-actualization and self-transformation, and that's what spirituality is all about. So from a point of view of personal growth, and at least understanding the maps and understanding what some of the processes and techniques are, then the next couple days would be an opportunity to explore that. So, as they say, a word to the wise, and that some of you are meant to be there and some of you are not meant to be there. And you know who you are, and you know what your individual excuses that you're giving in order to prevent your own growth and evolution. So I'll let you simply wrestle with those. The second thing I want to mention is that in September we have an opportunity coming up that has only happened once and may not happen again. So we're going to be gathering in Fiji, and we're going to be doing an 8-day training, or 8 or 9 or 10 or 8.5, okay, on modeling. Now then, this training is going to be unique in a couple of ways. One, in order to get into it, you're going to have to be at least a master practitioner or a trainer. In Master Practitioner and in this training, Mark will spend a couple of days on modeling and begin to scratch the surface. And modeling is the process through which NLP was generated in the first place. And the tragedy is that the people that created it simply stopped where they did and didn't go on to continually generate further models that could begin to make a big difference in the world. So it's an opportunity to come together with a group of people that are at least a master practitioner or trainer level from all over the world and spend 8 days going into an in-depth understanding of what modeling is and how to actually go about doing it. And we're particularly going to be focused on a business context. So I've already indicated in the last year, my wife and I, for the last couple of years, have been working on this modeling project in England on entrepreneurs. So. And right now, we're also working on a modeling project, as I mentioned, with the gentleman who is able to teach people to speak a language proficiently in 3 days. So there's opportunities then, certainly for modeling in business and modeling in education. So some of you may have a couple of things that you're asking yourself. One is, are you capable of doing modeling? And the answer is, that's the purpose of the training, is to get you to that level. 2, are there applications of it in which could be specifically valuable to you? And the answer is yes, because it gives you a methodology to capture excellence, to go out, find people that are good at things and figure out how they do it and design ways to transfer that ability to yourself and that ability to other people. How do we get better? How do we get better? Frequently, the way we get better is we may read books. Books are usually somebody's theory about what works. The people that are the people we really need to be paying attention to are the people that are already successful at doing something that we want to be able to do. Success leaves clues. Instead of studying somebody's theory about what works, we need to be studying what people that are successful actually do. And that's what modeling is all about. And as a process of this course is to learn the skills and abilities that will allow you to do that in an efficient and effective manner. Now, on Wednesday night, we're going to have in this room here, at 7:30, we're going to meet anybody that's interested in specifically coming to the training or simply in finding out more about modeling and about how it works. So even though you may at this point think that you're not ready for the training, even though, once again, you have an infinite ability to fool yourself. But in any case, you would probably be valuable to learn a little bit more about the modeling process And so by coming here and investing a couple hours at Wednesday night from 7:30 to 9 or 9:30, depending on your interest and where we go, at least then you'll have an opportunity to find out more about modeling, because if you're not going to do it now, then at some point down the road, then this is like the crown jewel of NLP, and it's the area where NLP can make potentially the greatest contribution in the world, and it's something that sooner or later you need to explore in much more depth and detail. So in any case, be here or be square, Wednesday at 7:30. And then start programming on your timeline, September and Fiji. If you want to be one of the cognoscenti, you will be there. The third thing is I wanted to talk a little bit about this. So, my wife and I have had the excellent opportunity over the last 12 years or more of working with the U.S. Olympic diving team. And we started working with Olympic athletes and working with them and doing what we call mind coach. So what happens is they all have what we call body coaches or physical coaches that teach them how to dive. But diving is like any other complex activity, involves you've got to be able to work with the body in order to physically do a dive. But if you can do it once, you're capable of doing it. The question is, how do you do it continually and consistently? If you can do it once, you're capable of doing it. The key to athletic performance is to be able to do it continually and consistently. The key to being able to do it continually and consistently is not in your body, it's in your mind, your emotions, and your spirit. So therefore, in Mind Coach, we work with all three of those things in order to get people to be able to perform consistently on a high level. And now my wife does a lot of one-on-one phone coaching with divers, with golfers, with people in other sports, and she's really probably, from my point of view, the best person in the world at this. She's certainly the best person I've ever met, and she's far better than I am on one-on-one on this situation. So she's basically taken all of the, not all, but some of the wisdom she's accumulated over several years in working with performance and put that into a set of 3 CDs. Now, the amount of energy she's put into this set of 3 CDs is frightening. She spent like 2 years working on this thing, massive number of hours. So as far as the return on investment, I'm not sure if we were charging out her time that we'll ever get a return on that, but that's wasn't what it was all about. What it was all about was that she had something to communicate, about how to increase performance, about how to learn to do things consistently, and so you have a date with the Mind Coach. And the Mind Coach then is the Mind Coach, this is a 3 CD dialogue between the Mind Coach and an aspiring athlete, or Jaron, who wants to learn how to win in the great games and how to compete. In order to do that, he has to learn how to control his mind, how to control his heart, and how to control his spirit. So he has 3 CD sessions with the Mind Coach in order to be able to discover these things. So in any case, once again, I would urge you that there's an opportunity here. And later this afternoon, sometime when Eileen comes back during one of the breaks or something, we may play a few sections out of it so that you'll begin to hear what it's about. If nothing else, simply listening to the voice is going to be one of the better trances you're going to have, and it's going to serve as an ability to relax you and inspire you and give you enough to think about to spend, at least it'll serve you for the rest of this lifetime, if not several after that. So in any case, enough said. So I realize it's kind of expensive. I apologize for that. I realize there's a difference in economy scales between different places, but I think what you need to understand, of course, is the difference between price and value. So price is simply what you pay for it, and value is the changes and transformation it can give you over a lifetime. So the price may be high, but the value is inestimable. So.
Are you saying that all the conversations in the CDs are applicable in any form of our life? Whether it's
Correctly, yes. So because in any area in which we want to be better, then that's what it's about. So most of us are not going to be professional athletes, but all of us then need to be able to perform in an optimal fashion. And all of us, there are things that we can do, which means that we're capable of doing them. And then the problem is, what is our excuse for not doing them consistently and not consistently operating in a peak performance state? So what it's about is ways to get into that state and things to do. So in any case, that's enough as far as the three sermons for the day. So what we want to do is we want to move on, and we're going to be working this afternoon more with emotions. We're going to now switch to another aspect of the emotions, which is an interesting aspect because it comes as a surprise basically to most of us, because it's not something that's occurred to us or that we wouldn't normally think about. And what it is that emotions actually come in a certain sequence. Emotions come in a certain sequence. One way to look at this is that we've got energy, and that there's different levels of energy, and at different levels of energy, then we find different emotions. So that normally what we assume is that we can just go from one place to another, that our emotions are totally random, that we simply jump around from one place to the other, and that other people jump around from one place to the other. Where actually there's a sequence that we go through and that other people go through. And once we understand that sequence, there's certain things we can do with that, which is what we're going to be discovering and exploring here for the next couple hours. And then we'll move on to some more stuff on emotions. So, there are various models of personality, and one, of course, is the Myers-Briggs, which you've been taught. And another one of the more sophisticated models of personality is a model called the Enneagram. And the Enneagram divides people into 9 different personality types. And whereas the Myers-Briggs, has presumably like 16 different types, but basically they're combinations of 4 different things. And the one thing that the Enneagram does that goes beyond a lot of the other personality models out there is that it's obvious when you look at a person, or when we look at our own experiences, that our emotions, that our behaviors change, and they change in 3 ways. So one, we have a place where we normally hang out. We've got an habitual emotional range that we normally operate out of, and that we've got certain behaviors that we normally engage in. We've got certain habits. Now then, these habits and these emotions change as stress levels change. So when we get stressed out, then frequently we go to a different place. On the Enneagram model, actually, we move to a different place in the model under stress. So you've all known people, and a standard statement somebody will make is, I don't see how anybody can live with that person. Well, they couldn't live with that person if that person was being the way they normally are, but they're not that way when they're living with that person, or they're not normally under stress. So when we all are under stress, then frequently our behaviors shift, and they frequently shift in ways that may be negative. And so we need to understand that everybody's behavior to some degree changes with the stress levels in their life. Now, also the opposite of stress is there are conditions in which we're totally relaxed, totally comfortable, totally intimate with other people, and our conditions once again shift. So the people we really care about and we really like, we treat totally different from the people we don't care about and we don't like. So that seems obvious. So one of the things is any model that we're going to use to understand our behavior, if we're trying to say that we always behave the same way all the time, that's ridiculous. In NLP, we say we've got to take context into account. So the context we've got to take into account is how do you behave under stress, how do you behave whatever normal is, and how do you behave under conditions of intimacy where you're relaxed and you're comfortable. And so therefore you need to type people at least 3 places based on the changes in behavior that are going to occur. Now then, given that, we have several, when we look at emotions, we have what we're going to call the changes. It'll change throughout the day. It changes depending on, certainly it changes then depending on the circumstances. So we've got an acute tone, which is where we are at any moment in time, and that will be continually changing. Second is we've got a chronic tone, and the chronic tone is pretty much our habitual place. In other words, that's where we are normally. That's where we normally hang out within a certain range. And then the third thing is we have a social tone. So the social tone is kind of similar to the fact either that we're putting on a mask in social situations because we don't want to let people know what terrible ogres we really are, so we have to mask that or hide that, or it may be in social situations where we're comfortable and relaxed. Then we come up with another tone. So we've got the tone of where people are, we've got the tone of where they chronically are, and we've got the tone of where people are, then the mask they put on in social situations. Now then, also we can either go up the scale or we can go down the scale. There are things that are going to take us to a lower level, and as we get stressed out, then we begin to drop down. Or as we get excited and enthusiastic about something, we can begin to move up. So it's possible then to move up or to go down from where we normally are. So we're up and down, we're up and down. So there's a scale, and it's called the tone scale. Now, in one of the forms in which you find it today is in Scientology. So Scientology is a mixed blessing, and beyond that, I won't say anything more about it. And one of the models then is Scientology is like an LP. It's a good synthesis of a lot of different things. So a lot of which are of some fairly sophisticated technology, and one of the things that it's a synthesis of is the tone scale, which was got elsewhere. And I've spent some time trying to trace down exactly where the roots are, and it's hard to, anyway, the guy in northern Washington State in the States developed it, and it was developed back in the 30s, and he's dead, and the people that he worked with are dead, so it's hard to get the exact source. But in any case, it still is present in a certain form in Scientology. Now, the Scientology has an expanded version of it that's not particularly relevant to where we're at, but we're going to deal with the part of it that's particularly relevant to where we're at. So, in order to understand this model, or what we call a tone scale, what we need to understand is that we've got, once again, you've got a level here, and you've got things that are below the level, which we'll call negative, and you've got things above the level, which we'll call positive. So, people can be at different places on it. All of us can acutely, in other words, under certain circumstances, may be capable of being at any point on this. In general, we've got a place where we more or less habitually hang out, and as I said, we may have a place where we go socially. So let's look at this scale, and then as we look at the scale, we'll then begin to see what some of the things that we can begin to deal with it. So there's expanded and contraction versions of the scale. So perhaps the thing to start with would be this piece of paper here. So you had handouts today you were given on this, so Now, part of the problem is also some of the language here. So that's the first thing that we've got to get around, because some of the language that's used is confusing at best, and we need to understand. Also, part of the problem is, you see, when we start with emotions or we start with words, each of us has our own complex equivalents, and different complex equivalences lead to different understandings. So we need to understand this. So, we basically have a scale. Now, the scale then has got numbers on them, and we'll see a little bit about what some of the numbers mean in a moment. And actually, the bottom of the scale is left off. So what you need to write on the bottom of this piece of paper, down here, you need to write 0, 0. And next to that, you need to write death. So at the bottom of the scale is death. Death is we have no energy whatsoever, and we've dropped off the bottom of the scale. So at the top of the scale, we've got enthusiasm. Enthusiasm, excitement. In other words, we're entering into life, we're enjoying life, we're actively engaged in life, so that this is kind of an active-passive scale. So once again, what you want to do is you want to draw a line, and you want to draw a line right below 2.5. You want to draw a line right below 2.5. So the things below 2.5 are actually negative. They're going to take energy. The things above 2.5 are basically going to then either give us energy or are going to be neutral. So actually, we could draw a line below 2.5, and we could draw a line above 2.5. So 2.5 is basically average. That's basically neutral. Everything below it is going to drain energy. Everything above it is going to give energy. Now, there's a lot more below it than there is above it. So let's first just take a second and look at the things above it. So we've got boredom. So boredom is fairly neutral. So boredom is basically then the spectator. We're looking at the world. The world is a stage, and we're the audience, and other people are the audience. The person is neither contented or discontented. Below 2.5, people are discontented. Above 2.5, people are contented. And so at 2.5, people are simply the spectator, the bored. They endure things. They're purposeless, careless. They're not threatening, but they're not helpful. So 2.5 is the neutral space. Everything above that is then going to be contented and positive, and everything below it is going to be discontented and is going to view the world then in a negative state. So we're going to view the world, the glass is half full or half empty. So let's look above it. So the first thing we find above it is conservatism. Now, once again, conservatism is not usually a positive word for most of us. So simply right next to conservatism, write the word contentment. Write the word contentment next to conservatism.
We've already got contentment.
You do. Okay, you got it on another piece? 2.8 you've got. Are we looking at this piece of paper? Okay, we are looking at this piece of paper. Okay, so actually there are various forms of contentment. So we've got contentment, we've got mild interest, we've got conservative. So we've actually got this spread out. Okay, so I'm looking at a different thing here. Once again, we can expand or contract the scale. So part of the problem is I'm looking at different things. So okay, so we'll deal with this contentment. So then contentment is basically that the person at a contented level is it's basically, okay, we're pretty satisfied with where we are. We're not bored, but we're not enthusiastic. We're just content, and content is obviously somebody that's content and satisfied with where they are. There's no real incentive to go anywhere else. But it's basically then on the positive side, and so it's simply that they're satisfied, they're content with where they go. And then the next thing, it may be that we begin to get interested in something, we begin to get excited, we begin to get enthusiastic, and so there's mild interest. So we now are slightly moving toward the positive. There's something we're mildly interested in. And then conservative, we could have medium interest. So it's like it's something that we are interested in, that we are actively interested in, that we are amused by, that we're getting energy out of. And then we move into strong interest. So strong interest is obviously something that we're beginning to get excited, we're beginning to get interest, and then we begin to move out of this into cheerfulness and enthusiasm, in which we now are flexible, we're enthusiastic, we're excited, we've got our energy moving, we've got it focused on something. And so the question is, who do you want to hang out with? Part of the question is, who do you want to hang out with? And who do people want to, and where do people want you to be when you're hanging out with them? So do you want people that are bored? Well, everything is relative. So it's probably better to have somebody that's bored than somebody that is in fear. On the other hand, is it better to have somebody contented than somebody that's bored? Is it better to have somebody mild interest than somebody that's simply contented? Is it better to have somebody with medium interest than mild interest? Is strong interest better? Is cheerfulness and is enthusiasm? So enthusiasm frequently we say is contagious, and people like to be around enthusiastic people, because enthusiastic people have found something in life that they're excited and motivated about, and that they're basically focused on that. So now let's look below boredom. Let's look below boredom and see what some of the levels are here. What are some of the levels here? So that down at the bottom, we're going to start once again. At the bottom is death. Now, what is right above death? Right above death is basically apathy. Apathy is where you don't care. Apathy is one stage removed from death. So you've given up, you've turned off. Suicides occur when people are at the apathetic level. People die when they no longer care whether they live or die. And then circumstances frequently simply move them toward death. Addicts, alcoholics, gamblers, fatalists, all of these people you may find down at the apathy level. In other words, there's nothing in life that they are excited or enthusiastic about, and they're simply apathetic. They don't care. Above apathy is grief. So actually, grief is a more powerful emotion than apathy, because grief experiences some kind of a sense of loss. So usually we can tell people are in grief because they're whining. They're whining. They're always talking about grievances and old experiences. They dwell in the past. They feel betrayed. Everything is painful. They experience a sense of loss. So what is grief? Grief is out of a sense of loss. So people that are grieving are always living in the past. It's like they had something at one time that gave life meaning, and that's lost. So now they're in grief for what once was there. Now then, above grief is sympathy. Now, sympathy, we might think, well, isn't sympathy a positive thing? But sympathy in this case is simply a case of sympathy is a case of obsessive agreement. So it's like it's not something we're doing out of compassion or care. It's something we've got no choice about. So it's a passive form. It's an obsessive agreement. We're afraid of hurting others. And so we're doing, and so basically, somebody that wobbles between like complacent tenderness and tears. So it's like their obsessive agreement, they're continually feeling other people's pain. They don't have the ability then, they're not strong enough themselves really to particularly empathize. It's simply that they feel sympathetic for other people, but they're not capable of doing anything particularly themselves. Above this then is the level of fear. Now fear, obviously we understand. Fear then is when we are afraid, we're frequently caught in indecision, we're indecisive, and we are afraid of something. And particularly in Maslow's hierarchy, as we move down into survival, we may have something concrete to fear, or it may be a generalized fear. But as we said earlier, fear is an emotion. What would happen if you could put fear and doubt out of your life? What would happen if you could put fear and doubt out of your life? So the person in fear is living their life in reaction. They're living their life in reaction to whatever it is that they are afraid of. So their life is determined by that thing that they fear. They're basically a coward. They're anxious. They're suspicious. Suspicion goes with fear because you're always suspicious of those around you. And because you're afraid, fear leads to suspicion. Fear leads to suspicion of other people's motives. In Star Wars, one of the things is now that Yoda is concerned because Darth obviously is in fear, and fear leads to anger, and anger leads to the dark side. So, okay, above fear we have covert hostility. Now, covert hostility is the cheerful hypocrite. This person is the person that on the surface appears to be your friend, but actually they're coming out of fear and they're actually sticking knives in your back. So covert hostility is the most dangerous place on the whole thing, because these people are in hiding. These people are in disguise. These people appear to be on the surface, to appear to be friendly, but in reality, they're afraid, and the way they deal with their fear is by smiling while they're sticking a knife in your back behind you. And you can tell the covert hostiles, frequently when you meet them, they're hard to tell. But if you hang out with them, one, you'll find that they never assume responsibility. They always take credit for everything that anybody else did, and they always blame other people for everything. So it's like they're always finding somebody else. They're always bad-mouthing other people behind their back, which means they're going to be bad-mouthing you behind your back when you're not there. And we need to understand two things with each of these levels. We understand there's certain kinds of behavior they engage in, but we need to understand the reason for the behavior. And the reason for the behavior is basically they are afraid. They're afraid of you. They're afraid of other people. And the only way then they can deal with this fear is through covert hostility. Because overt hostility, if it was overt, they're so afraid that they would never be overtly hostile. So they have to hide it and be covertly hostile. Now above this is no sympathy. So no sympathy is like the cold fish, the unfeeling, suppressed violent anger, cruel, calm, resourceful, acidly polite. So the person is, once again, that this behavior then that comes out of this then is that this person is unfeeling. This person lacks the ability to go to second position. They basically got violent anger, but they're repressing it. They're cruel, calm, resourceful, dangerous. Above that is we've got anger. Now, anger, at least you see, begins to surface. People don't hide anger well. People below anger are basically operating out of various forms of fear. Once we get into anger now, we're getting into expressed hostility. When we got people at no sympathy and covert hostility, or basically restrained or repressed hostility, where anger, the hostility begins to break out. So in anger, obviously then, that the person now has something that they are upset about. There's two forms then of overt or expressed hostility, anger and antagonism. Now normally we wouldn't make a particular distinction between anger and antagonism, but the distinction here is that anger is more of a general thing, whereas antagonism is more focused. So the person knows in anger and antagonism what they're angry about, and they've got an object or something that they can begin to focus that on. Whereas the person who is simply angry frequently is generally angry, but they're not sure what they're angry at. Okay, so far we've got this list. Now, up to now, it may seem interesting, bizarre, and of course the immediate question is, so what? The immediate question is, so what? So, how do we begin to use this? So in order to use this, we've got to understand a couple things. We've got to understand where we're at. We need to understand where the other person is at. We need to understand that acutely we may be at any place on this, that we may have one place where we normally hang out, which is more or less our chronic tone, and we have another place where we may go under social conditions, which is the social mask. Now then, where this model becomes really valuable is the next step. And this has to do with influence. It has to do with influence. So I've already said in Goldman's emotional intelligence that there are 4 things we got to do. We got to understand ourselves. We got to control our own behavior. We have to understand other people's emotional levels, and we need to be able to influence other people's emotional levels. Now then, one of the things we've learned from NLP that's very interesting is that if you want to be able to move people, if you want to get what we call rapport, then you follow a certain sequence which is called pace and lead. Pace and lead. Now then, what the tone scale tells us is, which is very interesting, it tells us that if we want to be able to exert influence over somebody, then the way we're going to be able to exert that influence is either coming in where they are and then going to the next level, or coming in at the level immediately above where they're at. Coming in at the level immediately above where they're at. Because in their warped model of the world, the level immediately above where they're at is the level that they respect, and that from their point of view seems to have it together. And so from their model, that next point of view is the one that is going to be the one they're going to respect the most. So therefore, if we want to influence them, what we need to do is figure out where they're at and come in at the next level above them, because the next level above them is going to exert the maximum influence on them. Now, there are 2 corollaries to this. If we come in at a level below them, we're going to cause them to drop down, not to go up, and we're not going to influence them. And if we come in at a level more than 1 above them, we will be outside of their consensual reality. We will not influence them. We'll actually cause them to drop down tone. So this is an incredibly important thing to understand. So it's like classic example. So what do you do with somebody who is angry? What do you do with somebody who is angry? So what happens is you've got people that are angry, and so what will happen is somebody will be angry, and they'll come into a store or a situation, and the people in the store, the clerks, are taught to propitiate them, to make amends. And what happens is actually that's a lower level than anger, and it simply causes them to drop down. It doesn't get rid of their anger. Because if I come in and I'm angry, then as far as I'm concerned, an appropriate response on the part of anybody that understands anything is that you should be annoyed, angry, and mad at the world. And if you're not mad and you're sitting there calm, then as far as I'm concerned, you don't understand and you don't know where it's at, because if you did, you would be angry. So if you're dealing with an angry person, then once again, NLP says pace and lead. So what you want to do is you want to get angry with them, but not at them. You want to get angry with them, but not at them. So the